These two names could pop on Oregon's defensive line this year.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you all so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. It is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, the number one sports podcast network out there. Thank you all, especially my everydayers, for helping make that the case. ESPN picks their 3 true freshmen that could see the field in a meaningful way for Oregon this year. I agree with one. I might agree with another. I have serious questions about the third, and then some thoughts on Oregon's schedule later on today's show as well. So let's start with Tony Tuioti. My everydayers know I mentioned I was going to talk about this today. He spoke recently after one of Oregon's practices and had a couple of really interesting insights. Several, honestly. Oregon's position coaches have been given some great stuff, frankly, for me to talk about on the show. 2 names that really stood out, and there were a lot of guys mentioned who I'm going to discuss, but Matthew Johnson and Elijah Rushing are the 2 names that from Oregon's defensive line coach I thought really stood out from what he said. So let's start with Elijah Rushing, a guy who's facing a really interesting situation. He's going into his 3rd year with the Ducks, former 5-star recruit, has not seen the field in a meaningful capacity. And when you look at the other 5-star edge prospects that were also in that 2024 class, he has wildly underperformed compared to the other 2. But unlike a lot of players in college football and from Oregon's defensive line room, he hasn't transferred. And Tony Tuioti noted early in his press appearance that Elijah Rushing is up to 285 pounds. He was 250 coming out of high school. And he also noted that Rushing can slide to the interior of the defensive line, show some versatility, and rush the passer from that particular spot. Now, when I talked about him when he committed to the Ducks back in that 2024 recruiting class, this was not something that was really expected. I suppose it was always possible, but it definitely wasn't a part of my thoughts on Elijah Rushing or on other thoughts who I talked about with here on the show. I don't think that was a point that Brian made when he came on to talk about his film. He was kind of a pure edge prospect sort of guy who, I don't remember the exact episode, I'm almost certain I would have compared in some form or fashion to Kayvon Thibodeau. But him being up at 290 pounds, now I think of him more from a body type standpoint, more in the Jordan Birch mold, who was 6'5", I think he was 295-ish, 290, 295, and just had way more athleticism than a guy of his stature and build should have been able to have. But Rushing, having bulked up 35 pounds over the last 2 years plus this offseason as well, that's a pretty significant amount. Now, does that mean he jumps up and starts on Oregon's defensive line? No, I don't think so. But as I've talked about with this group a lot in the offseason, this is a unit that is looking for depth. And there are questions about where that depth is going to come from. And Coach Tuioti mentioned that he's really started to work at being better stopping the run, and that's an area that has maybe held him back based on how the question was framed to Oregon's defensive line coach. That might have been the area where he was struggling with the most. And now it seems that he's really changed his body and is making those sorts of plays on the practice field so far. So that was the first name that really stood out. Second one is Matthew Johnson. And this is a guy that I've mentioned before, but I think should be on folks' minds going into the spring game on April 25th. He actually had a great spring game last year, and he was not one of Oregon's higher-rated recruits a season ago. He was a 4-star guy, but not, some big Tank Jones or, frankly, Elijah Rushing type of recruiting win. And by the end of last season, he was playing pretty regularly. So especially with the injury to Tony Cumberland, who's going to miss all of spring practice, Matthew Johnson is a guy that I just keep hearing his name pop up, whether it's from a coach, articles, people I talk to. It's a name that continues to populate the Oregon sphere, or whatever we're going to call all of this space. So I think that's another guy on the interior that you should be watching out for. DeAndre Robinson is also somebody, the North Carolina transfer, that Coach Tuioti highlighted when he was asked about the newcomers and what guys can really bring to the table. And he mentioned that he's really looking for interior guys that can not just be a factor against the run and swallow up double teams to create lanes for linebackers, but also be able to get after the passer. And this Oregon defensive line was really good last year. They were not as productive in terms of actual sacks as they would probably like to be. This was an elite defensive unit, and the D-line has got 4 NFL players on it. They need to be better as a whole, getting after the quarterback. And I think their pressure numbers were pretty good, but their quarterback sack numbers were not as high as you'd like them to be. They had 30 last year. That was tied for 62nd in all of college football. And generating more of an interior pass rush. Bear Alexander's not a guy that did a ton getting after the quarterback last year. Amari Washington certainly had moments, but I think can be more consistent in that realm. But you need the guys that are rotating in for those dudes on the interior to have that ability too. And it sounds like Matthew Johnson is one of those guys. And DeAndre Robinson too has got that sort of ability. Another guy that was brought up, Nasir Wyatt. And Coach Tuioti threw out the acronym DPR, designated pass rusher, and that's what Nasir Wyatt was last year. And he emphasized how much he has grown this offseason to being a more complete player. And look, we should be able to get at least a glimpse of how much he's grown in that regard when the spring game takes place on April 25th. Once the games actually start on September 5th, game 1 against Boise State, that's an important thing for Oregon's defense this year, because if Nasir Wyatt can keep his pass rush ability but be playable against the run, that's good for this year. But for next year, that's borderline of vital importance, because both Mateo and Tatum are done after the season. And I got to shout out my guy, Eric Scopel, friend of the show over at 24/7 Sports. He made a great comparison between two guys that played as true freshmen last year. That was DR Hill on offense and Nasir Wyatt on defense. They were both so good at the one role they really excelled at. For DR Hill, that was getting the ball on the perimeter. And for Nasir Wyatt, that was rushing the quarterback. But now this offseason for them is about developing into more well-rounded players so that they can be complete weapons and make Oregon less predictable when those guys are on the field. So those were a couple names. Tank Jones got a shout-out from Coach Tuioti as well. Also praised his versatility. Said he's a guy that can line up in a 3-tech, can slide to the inside, and that he's understanding the defense very well, which he said is pretty complex. But the quotes, just to go back to Nasir Wyatt for a moment, I just wanted to make sure I didn't forget the Tank Jones shout-out that Coach Tuioti had in there. But he said, quote, "He's gotten a lot stronger. He can win with speed and power now," which would make him truly an elite pass rusher if that's the case, and said he has, quote, "very powerful hands for a guy his size." So lots of good stuff there from Tony Tuioti on the defensive line. And the depth of this group is the far bigger question. There's some questions for the starters, right? The sack numbers I mentioned, especially with Mateo and finishing plays like that, that's an area where that group has to be better. But the biggest questions come from the depth, and there's no shortage of options. It's just a matter of, right now until September 5th, figuring out who are those guys going to be. So stoked for this group, and stoked that Coach Tuioti gave me just the easiest segment imaginable. Just go through it, and he's just got boom, 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 big time quotes. So let me know your thoughts about who you think could break out on the defensive line in the comments below. Hit me up on Twitter, however you want to get in touch. ESPN made a prediction about which 3 Oregon true freshmen will play. I just mentioned one of them. The other 2, not as solid of a pick.
I'm Clea Butler, host of Locked On Women's Basketball, and this is Mazda's Women's Basketball Snapshot, celebrating the work no highlight reel can ever capture. The NCAA Women's Basketball Tournament Elite Eight wrapped up with the UConn Huskies staying undefeated at 38-0 after a decisive win over Notre Dame, while the UCLA Bruins rallied past Duke behind a dominant second half performance. On the other side, the remaining one seeds in South Carolina and Texas will be determined after their matchups against TCU and Michigan, respectively. Next up, the Final Four is set for Friday in Phoenix, with the winners advancing to the national championship on Sunday. These moments are earned off the clock, those long before the lights ever come on. The sweat, the fakes, the doubt, the scrapes, and coming back for more every time. Mazda puts that same drive into every detail. Wins define the moment, putting in the work, that defines you. There's more to a Mazda because there's more to you.
Thank you for making this show your first listen every day. If you tune into every episode and want to level up, join the Locked On Everydayer Club. Get this show with ad-free audio in the Everydayer Club, plus members-only Discord access. Join at the link in the description of the show notes below and become a Locked On Everydayer Club member today. UCLA Blue. Oregon plays UCLA this year for today's second segment sip beverage. All right, let's get to what ESPN put out a list of impact true freshmen that could show up for every team in college football. It's either every team in college football or the top 25, or I don't know. You can go find the list. So let's start with the one that I've already mentioned a little bit on today's show, but I've talked about before, and I have an SSA of 7.5 that Tank Jones has some type of role to play with Oregon this year, especially if he's got real positional versatility. Oregon's NASCAR package on the defensive line in third and obvious passing situations could just have a filthy amount of talent this year. And they had a lot of talent a season ago. This year's group, if you were to go, all speed pass rushers, like you're sliding Mateo and Tatum to the interior, and then you're bringing other guys in. You're putting Nasir Wyatt on the field. Maybe you're putting Tank Jones at one of those end spots. Maybe you're putting Elijah Rushing at one of those end spots. I love the way that they have really continued to stack talent, which they've needed to because of how many guys left via the transfer portal this offseason to seek other opportunities across the country. And, those were high caliber guys. And that's evidenced by the fact that no one went to a school that makes you go, oh my gosh, why would he go there? He's going to just, overperform, or he's overqualified. Like Blake Purchase went to Ole Miss. Terrence Green went to Alabama. Tioni Gray went to Notre Dame. Zadavian Sims went to Arkansas. There's one that I missed. I think Toby Hastrup went to West Virginia. He didn't play a ton last year. He might have had a chance this year, but Oregon, as I've mentioned, has got a lot of options coming off the edge. But yeah, I think Tank Jones is a good pick from ESPN because you have to evaluate the position group as well as the talent of the player you're dealing with. And Tank Jones is no worse than the third most talented player in this class. He's probably second, maybe first. We'll just have to wait and see how these guys' careers play out. But the only guy that was rated higher than him in the 24/7 composite rankings for this Oregon class is Nacho, who is the next guy that I'll talk about in just a moment. But when national outlets have these sorts of stories and pieces, I'm interested to see where their heads are at because it can provide a different perspective, or it can become clear, the person that did this didn't do his homework sufficiently, and I don't think that that's anywhere close to right. But Tank Jones is a good pick because he is, a guy that's been compared to Ruben Bain, who was, of course, a part of Miami's dynamic edge tandem last year and is about to be a first-round pick in the NFL draft. Obviously, it'd be awesome if that's what Tank Jones' career winds up being with Oregon. But yeah, Tank Jones, I think that's a good pick from ESPN. Next one, Nacho, Emmanuel Ihanacho, and he's the highest rated offensive line commit in Oregon history. He played left tackle and right tackle He could play guard. I mean, he can play kind of all over the offensive line. I'm more hesitant, even though the recruiting profile certainly suggests, yeah, this is a guy that physically is ready to go and has the athletic gifts to be able to make plays as a true freshman and make a legitimate impact, not just, get snaps or see the field at some point in time, but actually have a role to play. I don't know that I'm even penciling Nacho in as a starter. I think it's possible because you have legitimate openings at right tackle and left guard where you lost starters from a year ago and you're looking around going, there's no one that's got a definitive lead, at least not in my book. Alik Terry might feel differently. At left tackle, you are also replacing a soon-to-be NFL draft pick in Isaiah World, who was good, not as great as Oregon needed him to be all the time, but was definitely good a season ago. Fox Crater, though, is a guy that started last season in the USC game, and when World unfortunately went down with an injury against Indiana, he stepped in. Boy, he looks really good. Really, really good. So I don't think it's a 100% certainty he starts there. So maybe Nacho could push for playing time at left tackle. I think that'd be tough given that Oregon kind of quietly has got some serious offensive line talent there. But I think that what you have at left guard is a number of options who are just going to be more experienced. And boy, it is hard to beat experience. And having played against college football players in your career, especially on the offensive line, so Nacho has that disadvantage. But he's 6'6.5", 345. I mean, it's about as college ready as freshmen are going to get. He or Tommy Toffee, it wouldn't shock me, but I think a rotational role is more likely. Then there was the one that ESPN listed, which I understand, but I just don't know exactly. The reasoning wasn't that far off. But the last one that they listed was Jalen Lott, the 5-star wide receiver who was compared to Evan Stewart. I have seen those similarities as well. 6'1", fluid route runner, really good hands, explosive speed, does everything well. I 100% understand where they're coming from with that comparison. Where I can't get behind this one as being in the mindset of looking at Jalen Lott as an impact true freshman, this wide receiver class is loaded because Gatlin Bear, who was a 2024 recruit, is a 5-star, he's coming in. Then you've got Jalen Lott, and you've got Messiah Hampton, and you've got the guy who I have planted my flag as the most underrated player in Oregon's 2026 class, Hudson Lewis. Like, this collection of wideouts is really, really good. But Jalen Lott is being compared to Evan Stewart. Oregon still has Evan Stewart. And they brought in Iverson Hooks, the veteran transfer from UAB, who at his best will be Tez Johnson Part 2. But with any of these guys, and maybe Oregon's tight end usage goes down so much that there's room for a fourth wide receiver to really have a more significant role when everyone's healthy than a guy did in the Oregon offense last year. But is Jalen Lott starting over Evan Stewart, DeCorian Moore, or Jeremiah McLaughlin? I have a hard time seeing how that answer is any of those guys. So could he rotate in and be a factor? Yes, I can see that. But making a big impact, I would be surprised if any, as talented as they are, and my everydayers heard me break down all these guys' film over the last couple months, I am really high on this wide receiver group. Like, that position group is so well set up after this season, even though they're going to lose Evan Stewart after this year. Iverson Hooks, I believe, is done after this year. DeCorian Moore has to come back because you have to play 3 years of college football. And Jeremiah McLaughlin, we will wait and see because he was a 2024 recruit and DeCorian Moore is 2025. So he could technically go to the NFL. We'll see what kind of year he has. But even if J-Mac and Evan Stewart go, I know the talent's there. They've got plenty. Will they be able to keep them all out of the portal? Probably not, just because they have way too much talent in that room to seriously get the ball to all of them in a way that makes them think, okay, yeah, Eugene's the place where I want to go. But yeah, for Jalen Lott being an impact true freshman, I think that one, while understandable, is incorrect there from ESPN. But if you disagree, leave your thoughts in the YouTube comments below. Maybe there will be 5 wide receivers who have a real impact this year. And I'll measure for wide receivers impact as at least, because there can be varying degrees of impact, you got to have at least 300 yards receiving and a couple touchdowns. If you have that, that'd be a noticeable impact. But if you look up and, it's 13 catches for 150 yards and no touchdowns, like that's seeing the field, but that sounds like it might, in that statistical hypothetical, come up in mop-up duty. So, yeah, saw that list, thought I would discuss. And so I did. Speaking of something I saw to discuss, does Oregon have the second hardest schedule in the Big Ten? First, this episode brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are here, where every possession matters, every matchup is magnified, and every game can swing a series. And right now, FanDuel is giving new customers a great way to get in on the action. Here is what you'll like about it. You can bet just $5 and get $250 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. The app makes it easy to follow the action with player stats, trends, and matchups all in one place. And during the playoffs, that extra insight really matters when you're looking at stars, role players, and key moments. It just makes the entire playoff experience more engaging from start to finish. And if you wanted to bet anything college football related, all the Power 4 win totals plus Notre Dame are over there at FanDuel. So make sure you check them out whatever you're feeling, wherever you want to put your knowledge to the test. FanDuel is indeed the place to do it. Head to FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com. FanDuel, the official sportsbook sponsor here at the Locked On Network. Check them out at FanDuel.com. FanDuel, play your game. So over at collegefootballnews.com, there's a ranking put out of, because it is a list season, of course, every team's schedule in the country and who has the toughest ones. And according to that particular outlet, Oregon has the second hardest schedule in the Big Ten, which I completely understand. And poor Purdue and Barry Odom, they are listed as having the hardest schedule in the Big Ten. They have to play road games at Indiana. I think they have a neutral site against Notre Dame. They play at Penn State, at Iowa, at Illinois, while hosting Washington, Minnesota, Wisconsin. Yeah, the other games, winnable and such. They also host Wake Forest. That is a random football game. Wake Forest, Purdue. That is as random as it gets. Wake Forest led by Washington State and Pac-12 legend Jake Dickert. He had a really good season last year. I believe he was co-ACC Coach of the Year, or he should have been. But they've got Oregon in there at number 2, which is not really hard to see why when you look at the level of difficulty they have with some of their games. Interestingly enough, they've got Ohio State on November 7th as Oregon's toughest game. That's not a surprise. But try to remove feelings of a personal nature aside and ask yourself, what on paper is a tougher game? Going to USC or hosting Michigan? They are both difficult football games because those are really good teams with rosters and expectations to compete for the college football playoff this year. I'd argue that Michigan is a tougher game even at home than USC on the road because it's not a particularly long trip down to Los Angeles. You're not changing time zones. And while USC's home field advantage should show out in full force for that Oregon game because it's a monstrous game for USC, the Coliseum is not a top tier or even top half home field environment in the Big Ten. It just isn't. So playing at home, still a significant advantage there. But Michigan's roster was already going to be good. They didn't lose that many guys. And They bring in players from Utah with Kyle Whittingham, who's a darn good football coach, and he brought over two great coordinators from the Big 12 in Jason Beck, his offensive coordinator, who was at Utah last year, and Devin Dampier put up all sorts of huge numbers, and Jay Hill, the defensive coordinator at BYU, former head coach at Weber State. I've talked to Coach Hill on the phone before. Good guy, really good football coach. So, interestingly enough, College Football News puts Michigan as Oregon's fourth hardest game. And sitting at third, see if you can guess. I will list these in a random order. But which of these opponents feels like the third hardest game after going to Ohio State and to USC, which are certainly two of Oregon's toughest games this year? I'll exclude Portland State and Boise State because obviously not. Okay. Hosting Northwestern, hosting Nebraska, going to Illinois, hosting Washington, hosting UCLA, going to Michigan State, going to Oklahoma State. I bet plenty of you would say Washington. According to College Football News, they think Illinois is Oregon's third toughest game. It is on the road. You're going 2 time zones away. That's been a struggle for a lot of teams in the last couple of years. Oregon did go to Iowa and win last year. It wasn't easy. They went to Wisconsin the year before and won. It wasn't easy, but they found a way, went to Northwestern and won last year, and Northwestern was actually a pretty good team. I think they finished at 7-6. But Illinois just lost their quarterback, and they feel solid about the options they have to replace Luke Altmaier. But I don't know that I would, in any scenario, even with Luke Altmaier, which they don't have, but if he were returning, I'd still rank Michigan as above Illinois. And I respect Brett Bielema, and I think Illinois has been a good program the last couple of years off a somewhat disappointing 9-4 campaign, but like they were a good team. You got to go on the road. They've got a great fan base. It's pretty far away. I think Michigan is at worst Oregon's third toughest game, and I'd probably say they're second just because of the roster they have and the respect that I've got for Kyle Whittingham. So, list reaction season. What a fun time. I love a good list reaction. Let me task some of you with that. Obviously, keep sending mailbag questions, Spencer scale of agreement takes. All that stuff is great and dandy. But if you ever come across a list of a player, team, coach ranking, schedule, anything like that you find objectionable or want more thoughts on, send it my way. I love a good Oregon list reaction. So that's how we wrap today's show. Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. Until then, hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And go Ducks.